In a world full of lovers and fighters, I bet you can guess which camp I align myself with. Indeed, it doesn't take people long to figure out that I am a lover, someone who, for better or for worse, whether I should or not, tends to throw my heart at every situation and soul I encounter. For me, love is my raison d'être, my credo, my way of approaching life. And it's also my basis for understanding my Christian faith. On Friday night, I attended the Sacred Self concert of Pam Hodges at Queenswood United. She opened the evening singing her song, Love is Proof. And as the tears streamed down my face, I realized that for me, that is my essence of understanding God. That love, the love I experience, the love I witness, the love I share, the love I receive, is how I know, how I have the proof that God is. And yet, even for a lover like me, the word love is one which is difficult at the best of times for us to sort out. It is an ambiguous word. We love our parents, our children, our best friends, our spouses, but we also love our newest gadget or our cutest pair of shoes, or at least we say we do. We love our favorite song, the one that brings us back to that moment in high school or that carefree summer day. We love ice cream and the smell of spring and the feeling of newly laundered sheets. Love is a word that we throw around easily, perhaps too easily. And there's a danger that if we aren't careful with our intentions about that word, things can get very messy. When love has come to mean so many things, we're often not quite sure what others mean when they use it too. Is it some deep connecting force that binds us all together? Some dreamy emotion that distracts us? Is it a mode of operation? Must it always be tied to action? Can it be reduced to a simple feeling? Strange, this crazy little thing that we have experienced time and time again, and yet we just can't quite put our fingers on what love is. And I wonder if Jesus' disciples felt the same way as they gathered to listen to their teacher share the words that we heard in today's gospel reading. Now, perhaps some of the ambiguity we experience when hearing these words of Jesus from his farewell discourse, the words that he shared with his disciples only days before he would be taken from them and put to death, comes from issues of translation. In the Greek language of the New Testament, there are many different words that are translated to mean love, eros and agape being two of the most frequently occurring. We have worked very hard to come up with mutually exclusive definitions for these words, understanding one to be strictly focused on intimate desire, while the other has no trace of that type of passion, one to be associated with God and the other reserved solely for humanity. However, their translations, their definitions, like love itself, aren't so simple. That Jesus is describing to his friends in John's gospel today, the love that we are being commanded to share with one another, is translated from the Greek word agape. Agape is actually most accurately translated into the word charity. However, since the word charity in English has come to be almost solely associated with acts of philanthropy, agape is now translated as love so that we, the present-day readers, can grasp what is best meant by this ancient concept. So when we hear the word love in today's gospel, we shouldn't think of erotic love or familial love, but the word agape, which has at its heart an understanding of love as a theological virtue. Agape is the love that God has for humankind and that humankind has for God. This love is about God's nature and about how we are asked to share in that divine characteristic with each other. Now, I know this is a big concept for us to wrap our heads around, but I think it's important that we try and fully grasp it if we are to understand what it is that Jesus is saying to his disciples both then and today. When Jesus speaks to his friends and followers about love, about agape that he has for us and we are to have for each other, what he's saying is this: that while love may be a force, while it may be an action, as Christians, love is first and foremost a trait of God. God is love, and through God's grace, we are invited into that love, to experience it, each and every one of us, and to share it with others. So just what does this love of God look like? Well, Jesus describes it in sacrificial ways. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And that's exactly what Jesus did, offering his life for us on the cross. What we, who are not facing such a prospect in our own lives, might imagine this love to look like, could instead be a love that is primarily interested in the good of and for others. A love that is experienced in mutuality, in relationship, in a disciplined habit of care and concern. It is much more than a sentiment, much more than a feeling of euphoria. It is something that is deeply tied to character, learned from experience and perfected over a lifetime. It's something that is witnessed in how we live our lives. In 2008, a massive earthquake devastated the Chinese province of Sichuan, killing 70,000 people and leaving hundreds of thousands injured. Most of the rescue attempts during this catastrophe were attempted by average citizens using only their bare hands and sheer will. Of the many stories of heroism and courage that emerged, one is told of a group of rescuers who reached what had been the home of a young woman. Amidst the rubble, they saw the frame of this woman through the cracks. Her pose was somewhat strange, as she knelt on her knees like a person who was worshiping, her body leaning forward, her two hands out in front of her, almost like they were holding or supporting something. The house had crashed and collapsed on her back and her head. The leader of the rescue team knelt down and put his hand through a narrow gap in the wall to reach the woman's body. He was fairly certain what he would find, but was desperately hoping that this woman might still be alive. However, once he touched her body, he knew that she was gone. And as he got up to walk over and search the next collapsed home, he hesitated. Again, he knelt down and reached his hands through the narrow cracks to search the little space under her body. And suddenly he screamed with excitement, "A child! There is a child, and he is alive." The whole team worked together, carefully removing the piles of rubble from around the woman. And there he was, a 3-month-old little boy wrapped in a blanket in the safe space his mother had created for him. It was a glimpse of joy, a ray of hope in a time of so much destruction and pain. And it's this kind of story that we think of when we hear Jesus talking about agape, of sacrificial love. Stories of huge, grandiose actions, stories of courage and bravery that we can scarcely comprehend. Stories of love that seem so very big and so very noble that we can feel very small and insufficient when we think about them. But instead of us feeling woefully inadequate in the face of such acts, I think we would be better to focus on all the stories that came before this one. Because we just don't wake up one day and decide to give our life for someone. This is a love that we are habituated into. It's a love that we observe, a love that we practice, one that we experience in a million little ways that has the potential to turn into the story of this mother and her young son she saved. The beauty of this story, the beauty of the love that Jesus speaks of, is not just in the grand actions, but in the small steps taken every day toward the virtue of love. It's being in the grocery store with your child throwing a fit and being completely embarrassed, yet still responding in love. It's having your parent do the same thing, perhaps not in the grocery store, but whether you are a teenager or caring for an aging parent, you understand what I mean. It's being willing to remain with a friend who is going through the messiness of life and not being afraid of sitting with them in the pain. It's the million choices that we make, placing a dear one's needs before our own. It's the willingness to say no, to set limits, to speak truth. That's the power of love. The million little moments that train us to be people who can love each other with the kind of love that Jesus was talking about. Jesus calls his followers to practice these acts of sacrificial love, these moments of agape, for he says this is how we abide in his love. Jesus knows that it is in the living out of love, in the action of loving, that we come to understand the extent of God's love for us. Loving one another in all of the challenging, exhausting, heartbreaking work that means allows us to understand the full extent to which we ourselves are loved. For however hard it is for me to love others, I can be sure that it's equally hard for others to love me. So Jesus calls us to love one another, because when we do so, we discover our fullest selves. And in discovering our fullest selves, we discover the breadth and the height and the depth and the length of God's love for us. Love, especially this kind of love that Jesus is talking about to his friends, is experienced when we allow ourselves to be in deep and meaningful relationships. So Jesus doesn't just suggest to his followers, he commands them that they engage in loving one another. Because he knew that when we are invited into relationships, into communities that have been created by God, those are the places where we may safely struggle with our fellow human beings to figure out who we are and who we want to be. Jesus' commandment reminds us that we are bound to one another in God's agape love. We are united in our Christian family, held in our relationships, not by what I do or do not do, but rather by what God does, which is love. After all, it's God's nature to love. And herein lies our good news. Because whenever it is that we feel unlovable, whenever it is that we feel we have nothing left to give, whenever it is that loving feels too hard or too scary or too overwhelming, we are reminded that we have a source of love to tap into at all times. The reality is that the love of God, the love made known to us through Jesus Christ, is inescapable. Sure, we can make choices about how we live and act and relate to one another and to God, and that makes a difference in how we will experience that love. And that's what Jesus is talking about when he says keeping his commandments leads to abiding in his love. But whether or not we abide in it, whether or not we experience it, we simply cannot choose to not be loved by God. Constant, uncaused, never earned, this love of God is ours, each one of us, simply because we are. Even when we are empty, believe we have no love left to give, our God reaches out and gives us more strength and more patience and more hope and always more love. So I wonder, what difference might it make for each one of us in this coming week if we were to take seriously Jesus' commandment to demonstrate agape love, charitable love, sacrificial love, unearned love to one another? How might our world look if we were to approach every encounter that we have with the face of love? To understand every frustration with the heart of love, to make every decision in the light of love. What might our world look like if we were to love it unconditionally, uncontrollably, in the way that God already loves? And I wonder if Jesus shared these words with his friends because maybe that's just what Jesus imagined for the world that he would leave behind. My friends, we are so loved. May we love one another and abide in God's love for Jesus' sake. Amen.